I never thought a pile of snow would become the most expensive mistake the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association ever made. But here we are, 18 months later, and I'm still receiving thank you cards from my neighbors. It started on a bitter January morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa, when I woke up to find my driveway buried under 2 feet of fresh powder. The blizzard had rolled through overnight, transforming the whole neighborhood into a winter wonderland that would have been beautiful if I didn't have to get to work. I bundled up, grabbed my shovel, and spent the next hour clearing a path from my garage to the street. My back was screaming, my fingers were numb despite my gloves, and all I wanted was a hot shower and some coffee. Being a practical person, I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I tossed the snow onto my front lawn, not onto the sidewalk, not into the street, not onto anyone else's property. My own grass. The snow created neat white mounds across my yard, which I figured would melt in a few weeks when spring finally decided to show up. I thought nothing of it, went inside, showered, and headed to my job at the local hardware store. When I got home that evening, there was a bright orange envelope stuck to my front door. I pulled it off, already feeling a sense of dread. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA had a reputation for being aggressive, but I'd managed to fly under their radar for the 3 years I'd lived here. That streak was apparently over. Inside was a violation notice and a fine for $300. The infraction: improper snow disposal resulting in aesthetic disruption to neighborhood standards. I read it 3 times, certain I was missing something. I'd put snow on my own lawn. My own property. How was that a violation of anything? I called the number on the letter immediately. A woman answered on the second ring with a tone that suggested I was already wasting her time. Meadowbrook Estates HOA, this is Patricia speaking. Hi, Patricia. My name is Quinn. I just got a violation notice about snow on my lawn, and I think there's been some kind of mistake. No mistake, Mr. Quinn. Section 12, Paragraph 8 of the HOA covenant clearly states that all snow removal must be conducted in a manner that maintains the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. But it's my lawn. The snow is on my own grass. The covenant doesn't differentiate between different parts of your property, Mr. Quinn. All visible areas must maintain standards. Large piles of snow are unsightly and reflect poorly on the entire community. I felt my jaw tighten. Where exactly am I supposed to put the snow then? That's not the HOA's concern. You need to dispose of it properly. The fine stands. You have 30 days to pay, and the snow needs to be removed within 72 hours or you'll receive an additional fine. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. $300 for putting snow on my own lawn. I looked out my window at the white mounds scattered across my yard. They looked perfectly normal to me. Actually, several of my neighbors had done the exact same thing. The next morning, I walked around the neighborhood before work. Sure enough, at least 8 other houses had snow piled on their lawns. I took photos of each one, noting the addresses. When I called the HOA office again, a different woman answered. Meadowbrook Estates HOA, this is Brenda. Hi, Brenda. This is Quinn from 847 Pinewood Drive. I'm calling about the fine I received yesterday for snow on my lawn. I've noticed several other properties have the same situation, but I don't see violation notices on their doors. Can you explain why I'm being singled out? One moment, please. I heard typing. Mr. Quinn, I see your file here. The violation was reported by our board president, Patricia. If other properties are in violation, they would need to be reported as well. I can note your concerns. Patricia. Patricia from yesterday. Yes, Patricia Morehouse. She's been our board president for 6 years. Is there anything else?" I thanked her and hung up, pieces clicking together. Patricia Morehouse. The name sounded familiar, and then I remembered. 3 months ago, I'd been leaving for work when I saw a dog doing its business in her yard next door to mine. Not my dog. I didn't have one, but she'd come storming out of her house and accused me of letting my filthy animal destroy her grass. I tried to explain it wasn't my dog, that I didn't even own a dog, but she just pointed at me and said I'd regret lying to her. Apparently, she'd meant it. I paid the fine because I couldn't afford to have a lien placed on my house, which the letter threatened would happen if payment wasn't received. But I also spent that evening reading every single page of the HOA covenant. It was a massive document, 73 pages of dense legal language covering everything from approved mailbox styles to acceptable fence heights. Buried in Section 12 was indeed the passage about maintaining aesthetic standards, but it was vague enough to be interpreted however someone wanted. What interested me more was Section 41, which dealt with HOA board member responsibilities and the physical HOA office building itself. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA operated out of a small converted house on the edge of our development, right where Pinewood Drive met Oakmont Street. The building had a basement that served as a record storage area, and according to the covenant, board members were responsible for maintaining the property to the same standards they enforced on residents. An idea started forming. The next weekend brought another snowstorm, this one dumping 18 inches overnight. I got up early Saturday morning and cleared my driveway again, but this time I was more strategic. Instead of tossing the snow randomly across my lawn, I created a long, elevated berm along the side of my property that faced away from the street. I angled it carefully, packing the snow down into a solid wall about 3 feet high and 20 feet long. Then I waited. Monday morning, another orange envelope appeared. Another $300 fine. This time, the violation notice included a photo of my snow structure and additional language about deliberate aesthetic violations and structures built without approval. I was also informed that I was being put on the HOA's watch list and could face additional penalties. I paid that fine too, but now I was committed to my plan. Over the next week, temperatures remained below freezing, which was perfect. Every evening after work, I'd go outside and work on my berm. I extended it, reinforced it, and most importantly, I adjusted its angle. I'd taken measurements of my yard's natural slope and done some calculations. My property sat slightly higher than the street, and water naturally drained toward the back corner of my lot, where a small drainage ditch ran between properties. The HOA office was downhill from my house, significantly downhill. I also made several trips to the hardware store where I worked, using my employee discount to purchase supplies. PVC pipes, concrete mix, shovels, landscape fabric, and a few other items. My coworker Derek noticed my purchases and asked what I was building. "Just a little drainage project," I told him, "making sure the spring melt doesn't flood my basement." He nodded approvingly. "Smart. This much snow, you don't want to take chances." That weekend, I put everything together. I dug a shallow trench from my snow berm toward the back of my property, following the natural slope. I laid PVC pipe in the trench, creating a channel that directed water flow exactly where I wanted it to go. I covered the pipes with soil and dead grass, so they weren't visible from the street. The pipe ran all the way to the drainage ditch, but I'd added a special modification, a secondary branch that I could redirect if needed. It took me 2 full days of backbreaking work, mostly done after dark, so the nosy neighbors wouldn't see exactly what I was doing. By Sunday night, Everything was in place. The system was ready. Now I just needed the weather to cooperate. Tuesday, the forecast changed. A warm front was moving in, bringing temperatures into the high 40s. The snow would start melting and melting fast. Wednesday morning, I called in sick to work. I wasn't actually sick, but I needed to be home for this. I watched the weather obsessively, checking the temperature every hour. By noon, it was 43 degrees and sunny. The snow berm was starting to drip. I went outside with a long metal rod and carefully poked holes along the base of the berm, creating channels for the water to flow through. Then, I checked my pipe system, making sure everything was clear. The main pipe would direct most of the melt to the drainage ditch like normal. But I'd installed a valve that would divert a significant portion of the flow through my secondary pipe, which ran underground all the way to the edge of the HOA office property. Here's where I'd done my homework. The HOA office building was old, built in the 1960s. Its basement had window wells, those semicircular metal structures that surrounded below-grade windows. I'd walked past the building dozens of times over the years and noticed that one of the window wells on the back side of the building was partially rusted through at the bottom. The window itself was also old, with a frame that didn't quite seal properly. My secondary pipe terminated in the bushes right next to that window well, angled so that water would flow directly into it. By Thursday afternoon, the temperature had climbed to 48 degrees. The snow berm was melting steadily, water streaming down my carefully graded channels toward the pipes. I went outside and opened the valve, diverting 30% of the flow toward the HOA building. I then got in my car and drove around the block, parking on Oakmont Street where I could see the back of the HOA office. I waited. 20 minutes later, I saw it. Water was flowing into the window well, pooling at the bottom. The level rose slowly but steadily. When it reached the window, it started seeping through the gaps in the old frame. I drove home, went inside and made myself dinner. I didn't feel guilty. They'd fine me $600 for putting snow on my own lawn. They'd targeted me specifically because their board president had a personal grudge. As far as I was concerned, I was just managing my property's drainage, which was my right and responsibility as a homeowner. Friday morning, I went to work as usual. Derek mentioned that he'd driven past the HOA office that morning and saw a bunch of cars in the parking lot, which was unusual for a Friday. I just shrugged and went about my day. That evening, I found another orange envelope on my door, but this one was different. It wasn't a fine. It was a notice about an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for Monday night, mandatory attendance for all homeowners, with substantial fines for those who didn't show up. The weekend brought more warm weather, more melting, more water flowing through my pipe system. I left the valve open, letting nature take its course. Monday night, I walked into the community center building adjacent to the HOA office. The place was packed, every seat filled with people standing along the walls. The mood was tense. I found a spot near the back and waited. Patricia Morehouse stood at the front of the room behind a folding table, looking even more pinched and sour than usual. She was in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair styled in that aggressive soccer mom cut, and she wore a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Two other board members sat beside her, a bald man in his 60s who I recognized as Tom something, and a younger woman with dark hair pulled into a severe bun who kept consulting a laptop. Patricia banged a gavel on the table. "This meeting will come to order. We have serious matters to discuss." As many of you know, the HOA office building has sustained significant water damage over the past several days. The basement is completely flooded, and we've lost decades' worth of physical records. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Patricia continued, her voice getting sharper. The damage is extensive. We've had to hire an emergency restoration company, and the preliminary estimate is $45,000. This will require a special assessment on all properties in Meadowbrook Estates. Now people were talking loudly, voices overlapping. A man near the front stood up. How did this happen? Don't we have insurance? Tom, the bald board member, cleared his throat. We do have insurance, but there's a $5,000 deductible, and our policy doesn't cover flooding caused by natural water accumulation. The insurance company is claiming this is a maintenance issue, not a covered event. Maintenance issue. Someone else called out, meaning this could have been prevented. Patricia's face flushed. That's not relevant. The point is we need to assess each property $1,500 to cover the repairs and restoration. The room erupted. $1,500 was a lot of money, especially on top of the regular HOA fees everyone already paid quarterly. I stayed quiet, listening to my neighbors argue and complain. A woman in the middle row stood up. I recognized her as Janet from 3 houses down. Patricia, why wasn't the building properly maintained? You've been board president for years. This is your responsibility. The building was maintained, Patricia snapped. This is an unprecedented amount of snowmelt combined with unfortunate timing. It's no one's fault. Then why should we have to pay for it? Janet pressed. Because that's how HOAs work. We share the costs of community property. If you don't like it, you shouldn't have bought a house in an HOA. The meeting deteriorated from there. People were angry, Patricia was defensive, and nothing got resolved except that we'd have to vote on the special assessment at the next meeting in 2 weeks. As everyone filed out, I heard fragments of conversation. People were talking about the unfairness, about Patricia's attitude, about whether they could fight the assessment. I drove home feeling satisfied. $1,500 would hurt Patricia just as much as anyone else, after all. She lived in the neighborhood too, but I should have known she wouldn't let it go. Wednesday evening, I was making dinner when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Patricia standing on my porch with a clipboard and a phone in her hand, actively taking photos of my house. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Mr. Quinn, I'm conducting an inspection of your property. The board has received complaints about improper drainage modifications." My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. "What complaints?" "We have reason to believe you've installed unauthorized drainage systems that may have contributed to the damage at the HOA office." She craned her neck, trying to see past me into my house. "I need to inspect your property, including any recent excavation work." "No," I said simply. Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me. You don't have the right to enter my property without my permission. It's not in the covenant. I read the entire thing. Section 19 gives the board the right to inspect properties for covenant violations. Section 19, paragraph 3 specifies that inspections must be scheduled with 48 hours notice and the homeowner has the right to be present. You've done neither. If you want to schedule a proper inspection, email me through the official HOA channels." I closed the door in her face. Through the window, I watched her stand there for a moment, her face red with anger before she stomped back to her car. I immediately went to my backyard and looked at my pipe system. From the surface, you couldn't see anything suspicious. The pipes were buried, the disturbed soil had settled, and everything just looked like normal yard drainage. But if Patricia got a proper inspection scheduled, she might bring someone who knew what to look for. The next day at work, I pulled Derek aside during our lunch break. "Hypothetically," I said, "if someone had installed some drainage pipes in their yard and needed to remove evidence of the work, how would they do that?" Derek raised an eyebrow. "Hypothetically? Well, pipes underground aren't visible. And if the soil's been there long enough, it all looks the same. But if someone wanted to be extra careful, they could pull the pipes out and fill the trenches with matching soil. Or they could just leave everything buried. Without digging up the whole yard, no one could prove what's down there. What if there were photos of the yard before the work was done? Then that person should make sure their current yard looks exactly like those photos. Plants grow, snow melts, grass covers things. Nature's pretty good at hiding stuff. I thanked him and spent my afternoon thinking. That evening, I went home and carefully examined my yard. The pipes were well hidden, but the valve system was slightly visible if you knew where to look. I spent 3 hours that night digging up the valve, removing it, and filling in the hole. I left the pipes themselves in place since they were completely underground, but I eliminated anything that could prove they were part of an intentional redirection system rather than just normal drainage. Saturday morning brought another orange envelope. This time it was a formal inspection notice, scheduled for the following Wednesday at 10 in the morning. Patricia would be accompanied by a professional drainage consultant. I took the day off work. Wednesday morning I was ready. Patricia arrived exactly at 10, accompanied by a man in his 40s carrying a clipboard and wearing a company polo shirt with Henderson Landscaping and Drainage embroidered on it. "Mr. Quinn," Patricia said coldly. "This is Mark Henderson. He'll be evaluating your property's drainage system." I nodded politely and gestured for them to proceed. Mark walked around my yard, checking the slope, looking at the soil, examining the area where my snow berm had been. The snow was mostly melted now, leaving just scattered patches in shaded areas. "You had quite a bit of snow piled up here," Mark said, pointing to where the berm had been. "I shoveled my driveway," I replied. "Had to put it somewhere." "And where does the water go when it melts?" I pointed to the natural slope of my yard. "It follows the grade down to the drainage ditch in the back, same as everyone's yard on this street." Mark walked to the back of my property, examining the ditch. Patricia followed him, talking in a low voice I couldn't quite hear. He crouched down, looking at the soil, then stood and shook his head. They came back to where I was standing. "Mr. Quinn," Mark said, "your drainage appears to be standard for this area. The water follows natural grade to the communal drainage system. I don't see any evidence of modifications or redirections." Patricia's face went through several colors. "That can't be right. Check again. He must have buried pipes or created channels." "Madam, without excavating the entire yard, I can only assess what's visible. And what's visible is a standard residential lot with normal drainage patterns. If you want me to do a full excavation, that would require the homeowner's permission and would cost several $1,000s. Do it. The HOA will pay." I stepped forward. "No. You don't have my permission to excavate my yard, and Section 19 doesn't give you that authority. You can inspect, which you've done. Anything beyond that would require a court order." Mark looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Quinn is correct. I can't dig up his property without permission or legal authorization." We all stood there in tense silence. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over, Mr. Quinn. I know you're responsible for the damage to the HOA building. I'll prove it." "That's quite an accusation," I said calmly. "Do you have any evidence?" She didn't answer, just turned and marched back to her car. Mark gave me an apologetic shrug and followed. I thought that might be the end of it, but I underestimated Patricia's vindictiveness. Over the next 3 weeks, I received violation notices for increasingly petty things. My grass was allegedly too long, even though I just mowed it, and it was the same height as every other lawn on the street. My mailbox was supposedly 3 inches out of alignment with HOA standards, requiring a $200 fine and mandatory correction. The paint color on my front door, which had been there when I bought the house and never been an issue before, was suddenly deemed non-compliant. Each violation came with a fine ranging from $100 to $300. I documented everything, took photos with timestamps, and filed appeals through the official HOA process. Every appeal was denied by Patricia personally, with boilerplate language about maintaining community standards. I also attended the next board meeting, where the special assessment was put to a vote. The homeowners were split. Some understood the need to repair the building, while others were angry about the cost and felt the board should be held accountable for the maintenance failure. In the end, the assessment passed by a narrow margin. Everyone in Meadowbrook Estates would now owe an additional $1,500. After the meeting, I was approached by 3 of my neighbors: Janet, a man named Robert who lived on Oakmont Street, and a younger woman named Sarah from the next street over. "Lucas, right?" Janet said. "We've been talking. Patricia is targeting you specifically with these violation notices. We've been comparing notes, and you've received more fines in the past month than some of us have gotten in years of living here." "She thinks I'm responsible for the flooding," I admitted. "Are you?" Robert asked bluntly. I chose my words carefully. I shoveled snow from my driveway onto my lawn, which is what most people did. The snow melted when the weather warmed up. The water went where water naturally goes when it follows the grade of the land. Sarah nodded slowly. "So you're saying you didn't do anything any homeowner wouldn't do?" "Exactly. But Patricia has it out for you specifically," Janet said. "We've noticed she's had issues with you since that incident with the dog last fall." "I never owned a dog. That wasn't even my dog." "We know," Robert said. "I saw the whole thing. It was the Andersons' golden retriever from 2 streets over. But Patricia decided you were lying, and she doesn't let things go." We talked for a while longer, and I learned that I wasn't the only person who had issues with Patricia's leadership. She'd been board president for 6 years, running unopposed every election because no one wanted the headache of dealing with HOA politics. But her management style was authoritarian. She played favorites with certain homeowners while targeting others, and she had a history of using her position to settle personal grudges. "Someone needs to run against her in the next election," Sarah said. "This special assessment is the last straw for a lot of people." "When's the election?" I asked. 3 months. April, an idea formed. "What if I ran?" They all looked at me. Janet spoke first. "She'd make your life hell, even more than she already is." "She's already doing that." "At least if I run, there's a chance of actually changing things." Over the next week, I researched HOA election procedures. According to the covenant, any homeowner in good standing could run for the board, and the president was elected by majority vote of all homeowners. The current board consisted of Patricia and 4 other members, but the president held most of the power. There was one problem. I wasn't technically in good standing. I had unpaid fines from all of Patricia's recent violation notices. The total was now over $1,200. If I didn't pay, she could use that as grounds to disqualify me from running. I couldn't afford to pay that much, especially with the $1,500 special assessment coming due. I was a single guy working at a hardware store. My budget was already tight. But I also couldn't let Patricia win through financial intimidation. I filed formal appeals for every single fine, citing the specific covenant sections and including detailed documentation showing that my property was in compliance. I sent everything by certified mail and kept copies of every document. The appeals went to the full board, not just Patricia, which meant the other 4 members would have to review them. 2 weeks later, I received a response. Of the 8 fines I'd appealed, 5 were overturned by a 3-2 vote of the board members. The other 3 were upheld. That brought my outstanding balance down to $400, which I could manage. I paid it immediately to ensure my standing was current. Then I officially declared my candidacy for HOA board president. I submitted my paperwork to the board secretary, the dark-haired woman from the meeting whose name I learned was Amanda, and she confirmed I was eligible to run. Patricia's reaction was predictable. Within 24 hours, I received another inspection notice, and another violation for having non-conforming landscaping rocks in my garden bed, something that had been there for 3 years without issue. I documented everything, appealed it, and kept moving forward. I also started campaigning. I printed flyers outlining my platform: transparent financial management, reasonable enforcement of covenants, and ending selective targeting of homeowners. I walked door to door on evenings and weekends, talking to my neighbors about their concerns and frustrations with the current board. The response was overwhelming. People were tired of Patricia's leadership. They were angry about the special assessment, frustrated with arbitrary enforcement of rules, and ready for change. But many were also afraid. Patricia had power, and she'd shown repeatedly that she was willing to use it to punish people who crossed her. "If you don't win, she'll destroy you," one older gentleman told me. "I've seen her do it before. She'll fine you into bankruptcy if she can." "Then I better win," I replied. As the election drew closer, tensions in the neighborhood escalated. Patricia's allies, and she had some, started their own campaign, putting up signs and sending out mailings about the importance of experienced leadership and warning about the dangers of radical change. Some of the mailers contained thinly veiled accusations about me, suggesting I was financially irresponsible and couldn't be trusted with HOA funds. I responded by being completely transparent. I published my personal budget, showing exactly where my money went and proving I was financially stable. I also requested access to the HOA financial records, which as a homeowner I had a right to review. Amanda, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with Patricia's tactics, provided them. That's when things got really interesting. The HOA records showed some concerning patterns. Over the past 6 years, the annual budget had grown by 40%, but most of the increase went to administrative expenses and board discretionary funds. The special assessment for the flooded basement was actually the second one in 3 years. The first had been for emergency landscaping repairs, totaling $23,000. I dug deeper, requesting receipts and invoices. Some were legitimate, but others were questionable. The emergency landscaping repairs included $8,000 paid to Henderson Landscaping and Drainage, Mark's company, for work that wasn't clearly documented. Other expenses included frequent dinners charged as board meetings at expensive restaurants, and several $1,000s in consulting fees paid to a company I'd never heard of. I brought this information to Janet, Robert, and Sarah. We spent an evening going through everything, and Sarah, who worked as an accountant, pointed out several red flags. "This consulting company, Morehouse Management Solutions, does anyone else find that name suspicious?" she said. We Googled it. The business was registered to Patricia's husband, Gerald Morehouse. She'd been paying HOA money to her husband's company. "Is that legal?" Robert asked. "It depends," Sarah said. "If the company is providing legitimate services at fair market rates, and the board approved it with proper disclosure, maybe. But I don't see any record of board votes approving these payments." And some of these invoices are just labeled consultation with no details about what the consultation was for. We now had evidence of potential financial misconduct. The question was what to do with it. If we made accusations publicly and couldn't prove them, Patricia could sue for defamation. But if we had proof and did nothing, we'd be complicit in letting HOA funds be misused. I decided to take everything to a lawyer. I couldn't afford someone expensive, but I found an attorney who offered free initial consultations for HOA disputes. Her name was Grace Reynolds, and her office was in downtown Cedar Falls. Grace reviewed the documents I brought and took careful notes. She was in her early 30s, professional but approachable, and she seemed genuinely interested in the case. "This is concerning," she said after about an hour. These payments to her husband's company, combined with the lack of proper board authorization, could constitute self-dealing and breach of fiduciary duty. The HOA is essentially a non-profit corporation, and board members have legal obligations to act in the best interest of the homeowners, not their personal interests. What can I do about it? You have a few options. You could report this to the Iowa Attorney General's office, which oversees HOA governance. You could file a civil suit on behalf of the homeowners to recover the misappropriated funds. Or you could use this information to push for criminal charges if there's evidence of fraud. What would you recommend? She leaned back in her chair, thinking. Honestly, win the election first. If you become board president, you'll have direct access to all HOA records and the authority to hire forensic accountants to do a complete audit. If you lose the election, Patricia will almost certainly destroy or alter any evidence. She'll know you're onto her. That made sense. I thanked Grace for her time and asked what I owed her. She waved me off. First consultation is free. If you win and decide to pursue legal action, come back and we'll discuss representation. I enjoy taking down corrupt HOA boards. They give the whole system a bad name. The election was held on a Tuesday in mid-April. Voting took place at the community center from noon to 8 p.m. Every homeowner got one vote, which could be cast in person or by proxy if they couldn't attend. I took the whole day off work. I stood outside the community center from noon until 8, shaking hands, answering questions, and encouraging people to vote. Patricia did the same, positioned on the opposite side of the entrance. We didn't speak to each other, but the tension was palpable. By 8 o'clock, I was exhausted. My feet hurt. My voice was hoarse from talking all day, and I had no idea if I'd done enough. The votes would be counted immediately by Amanda and the other board members, with results announced by 9. At 8:30, Amanda emerged from the community center and asked Patricia and me to come inside. My heart was pounding. We walked into the main room where about 50 homeowners had gathered to hear the results. Amanda stood at the front table and cleared her throat. Thank you all for participating in this election. We had a 73% turnout, which is the highest in Meadowbrook Estates history. The results of the election for HOA board president are as follows. Patricia Morehouse received 112 votes. Lucas Quinn received 208 votes. The room erupted in applause. I'd won by a landslide. Nearly 2/3 of homeowners had voted for me. I looked over at Patricia, expecting anger, but what I saw was worse. She looked devastated, like her entire world had just collapsed. For a moment, I almost felt bad for her. Then she composed herself, stood up, and walked out without a word. The next morning, I arrived at the HOA office building for my first day as board president. Amanda met me at the door with a thick binder and a key ring. "Congratulations," she said. "I'm actually relieved. Patricia was getting harder and harder to work with." I need to show you where everything is and go over the transition procedures." We spent the next 3 hours going through files, computer systems, and administrative processes. Amanda had been the board secretary for 4 years and knew everything about how the HOA operated. She was professional, organized, and visibly more relaxed now that Patricia was gone. "Can I ask you something?" I said during a break. "Did you know about the payments to Morehouse Management Solutions?" Her expression darkened. I suspected something was off. Patricia always handled those invoices personally and told me they were approved, but didn't need to be in the meeting minutes because they were under the discretionary spending threshold. I flagged it to the other board members once, but she shut down the conversation and said I was overstepping my role as secretary. "I need to do a full financial audit. Can you help me organize all the records?" "Absolutely. I'll get started this afternoon." Over the next week, I worked with Amanda to compile 6 years of financial records. We organized everything chronologically and by category. The pattern of questionable expenses became even clearer. Morehouse Management Solutions had been paid over $90,000 during Patricia's tenure, with the payments increasing each year. The invoices were vague, and there was no documentation of what services were actually provided. I called Grace Reynolds and asked if she could recommend a forensic accountant. She gave me 2 names and I hired one, a woman named Victoria Chen, to conduct the audit. The HOA budget could cover her fee, which would be around $5,000 for a comprehensive review. Victoria worked fast. Within 2 weeks, she had a preliminary report. We met at the HOA office to go over her findings. "Mr. Quinn, I found substantial evidence of financial impropriety," she began. "The payments to Morehouse Management Solutions appear to be fraudulent. I contacted the business, and they have no records of providing any services to Meadowbrook Estates, HOA. When I spoke with Gerald Morehouse, he claimed he didn't know his business was listed as a vendor. He said his wife handled all his bookkeeping, and he just signed whatever she put in front of him. So Patricia was creating fake invoices. That's what it looks like. She'd write checks to her husband's company, forge his signature on the invoices, and then deposit the money into accounts she controlled. It's classic embezzlement. How much total? $93,472 over 6 years. I felt sick. That was HOA money, paid by every homeowner in the neighborhood through their dues and special assessments. Patricia had stolen nearly $100,000 from her neighbors. "There's more," Victoria continued. "The special assessment from 3 years ago, the one for emergency landscaping repairs, those repairs were never done. The money was collected, and then most of it was paid to Morehouse Management Solutions within 2 months. The second special assessment, the one for the basement flooding, that money hasn't been spent yet. It's sitting in the HOA account. So the basement repairs were never done either. They were, but the insurance company ended up covering most of it. The deductible was paid, but the bulk of the restoration work was covered under a different policy provision. Patricia told the homeowner's insurance wouldn't cover it, but that wasn't true. This was bigger than I'd thought. Patricia hadn't just embezzled money. She'd lied to homeowners to collect unnecessary special assessments and then stolen those funds too. "What do I do with this information?" I asked. "You need to report it to law enforcement. This is criminal fraud and embezzlement. You should also consult with your attorney about recovering the stolen funds through civil litigation." I called Grace Reynolds immediately. She agreed to meet that evening to discuss next steps. When I showed her Victoria's report, her eyes widened. "This is slam-dunk criminal fraud," she said. You need to report this to the Cedar Falls Police Department. They'll investigate, and if the evidence supports it, which it clearly does, the county attorney will file charges. Patricia could be looking at prison time. What about recovering the money? Once criminal charges are filed, you can pursue a civil judgment for restitution. The court can order her to pay back everything she stole, plus interest and legal fees. If she doesn't have the money, they can put liens on her property or garnish her income. The next morning, I went to the Cedar Falls Police Department and filed a report. The officer who took my statement was a detective named Morrison, a tired-looking man in his 50s who'd probably seen everything. HOA embezzlement, he said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. We get a few of these cases every year. Most people don't realize how much money flows through HOAs and how easy it is for board members to abuse their position. What happens next? I'll review this with the county attorney's office. If they agree there's probable cause, we'll open a formal investigation. That usually involves interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing bank records, and gathering additional evidence. If everything checks out, we'll make an arrest and file charges. Timeline is probably 4 to 6 weeks. I thanked him and left, feeling both relieved and anxious. I'd done the right thing, but I knew this would have major consequences for Patricia and her family. Gerald seemed genuinely unaware of what his wife had been doing, and I assumed they had kids. But then I thought about the homeowners who'd struggled to pay those special assessments, people on fixed incomes, or with tight budgets who'd scraped together $1,500 because their HOA president lied to them. Patricia had made her choices, and now she'd face the consequences. The investigation moved forward. Detective Morrison was thorough, interviewing board members, reviewing bank records, and building a comprehensive case. I had to give several statements, as did Amanda and the other board members. Victoria Chen provided expert testimony about her findings. 6 weeks after I filed the initial report, Detective Morrison called to let me know they were moving forward with charges. Patricia was arrested the next morning at her home and charged with felony theft, fraud, and embezzlement. The local news covered it, and within hours, everyone in Cedar Falls knew what had happened. The neighborhood reaction was mixed. Most people were shocked and angry that someone they'd trusted had stolen from them. Others felt bad for Gerald and the Morehouse family, who were now dealing with the public humiliation. Patricia's allies, the few who remained, tried to suggest that I'd somehow set her up, but the evidence was too overwhelming for those accusations to gain traction. The criminal case took months to work through the system. Patricia initially pleaded not guilty, but her attorney eventually convinced her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony theft and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, with 2 years suspended. She'd serve at least 2 years and then be on probation. The judge also ordered her to pay full restitution of $93,000 plus $22,000 in interest and court costs. The civil case was simpler. Grace Reynolds filed a lawsuit on behalf of the HOA to recover the stolen funds. Patricia's assets included her house, which had equity, and some retirement accounts. Through the judgment, the HOA was able to recover about $65,000 within the first year. The rest would come through payment plans and wage garnishment after Patricia was released from prison. More importantly, I was able to return the money from the second special assessment to all the homeowners. Since the basement repairs had been mostly covered by insurance, we hadn't needed that money. $1,500 went back to each household, which was a huge relief for many families. Gerald Morehouse divorced Patricia shortly after she went to prison. He sold their house and moved out of the neighborhood. I felt bad for him, but he rebuilt his life and eventually started over in a different city. As HOA board president, I implemented major reforms. I pushed through amendments to the covenant that required all expenditures over $1,000 to be approved by a full board vote with documented minutes. I established quarterly financial reports that were distributed to all homeowners. I created an appeals process for violations that included a panel of homeowners, not just board members, to prevent the kind of targeted harassment I'd experienced. Most significantly, I worked with Grace Reynolds to completely revise the covenant's enforcement provisions. The vague language about aesthetic standards was replaced with specific, measurable criteria. We eliminated the board's ability to impose fines without clear violations of documented rules, and we established a maximum fine structure that prevented financial intimidation. The neighborhood transformed. People were more engaged, attendance at board meetings increased, and there was a new sense of community. Without Patricia's authoritarian leadership and arbitrary enforcement, homeowners felt more comfortable in their own homes. As for my personal situation, the violations and fines I'd received were all formally reversed. The board voted unanimously to expunge my record, and even issued a formal apology for the harassment I'd endured. It didn't undo the stress and expense I'd gone through, but it felt like validation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia had targeted me because of a dog that wasn't mine, then fined me for shoveling snow onto my own lawn. That vendetta had led me to redirect snowmelt in a way that exposed the basement's poor maintenance. The basement flooding had triggered investigations that uncovered her embezzlement. If she just left me alone, she probably could have continued stealing from the HOA for years. One evening, about 18 months after the whole thing started, I was sitting on my front porch when Janet stopped by. She'd become a good friend through all of this. "You know what's funny?" she said, settling into the chair next to mine. "This whole neighborhood is better off because of a pile of snow." That's one way to look at it. I'm serious. If Patricia hadn't been so vindictive, if she hadn't targeted you specifically, none of this would have come to light. We'd still be paying inflated HOA fees while she stole from us. The basement would still be a mess, and we'd all be living under her thumb. She was right. The snow had been the catalyst, but the real issue had been Patricia's abuse of power and criminal behavior. My small act of redirecting drainage had exposed a much bigger problem. "I still get thank you cards," I admitted. "People thanking me for uncovering the fraud and reforming the HOA. It's weird. I just wanted to manage the snow on my lawn." Janet laughed. "That's what makes it a good story. You weren't trying to be a hero. You just stood up for yourself and everything else followed." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over Meadowbrook Estates. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. No orange envelopes on doors, no arbitrary fines, no authoritarian board president making everyone's life miserable. It had been a long, exhausting journey from that first morning when I shoveled my driveway. I'd been fined, harassed, investigated, and forced to fight back against a corrupt system. But in the end, justice had prevailed. Patricia was in prison, the stolen money was being recovered, and the HOA was functioning the way it should have all along. I served as board president for 2 years before stepping down. I'd accomplished what I set out to do, reform the system and hold the corrupt accountable. Someone else could maintain what we'd built. I was ready to just be a regular homeowner again, living in my house without drama. The following winter brought another major snowstorm. I went out with my shovel, cleared my driveway, and tossed the snow onto my lawn without a second thought. No violation notices appeared on my door. No fines, no harassment, no drama. Just snow on grass, melting naturally as the weather warmed. That's how it should have been from the beginning. But sometimes you have to fight for what should be obvious rights, and sometimes that fight reveals problems much bigger than you initially realized. I'd learned more about HOA governance, financial oversight, and legal processes than I ever wanted to know. But I'd also learned that ordinary people can make a difference when they stand up against corruption and abuse of power. The story of the snow became neighborhood legend. New residents would hear about it and ask me if it was true. I'd tell them yes, it was true, all of it. The snow, the fines, the drainage redirection, the flooding, the investigation, the embezzlement discovery, and Patricia's eventual conviction. They'd usually laugh at the absurdity of it all, but I'd remind them it was also a cautionary tale about what can happen when HOAs are mismanaged and board members abuse their authority. Grace Reynolds used my case as an example in presentations she gave to other homeowners about HOA governance and member rights. Victoria Chen referenced it in articles she wrote about financial oversight in community associations. Detective Morrison mentioned it when training other officers about white-collar crime investigations. And me. I went back to my job at the hardware store, served out my term as board president, and eventually just became Lucas Quinn from 847 Pinewood Drive again. A regular guy who'd once redirected some snowmelt and accidentally uncovered a criminal conspiracy. Every time it snows now, I think about that first morning when this all started. If I'd known where it would lead, would I have done anything differently? Probably not. Patricia's harassment forced me to take action, and that action set everything else in motion. It wasn't planned, it wasn't calculated, it just happened. But I'll admit, there's a certain satisfaction in knowing that my response to her unreasonable fines ended up exposing her crimes. She tried to punish me for something completely innocuous, and in doing so, she drew attention to her own corruption. That's poetic justice if I've ever seen it. The HOA still exists, of course. It has to, for the neighborhood to function. But it's a different organization now. One focused on actually maintaining common areas and enforcing reasonable rules, rather than enriching board members and targeting individuals. The annual budget is transparent, expenses are documented and approved, and homeowners have real input into decisions. I still live at 847 Pinewood Drive. I've thought about moving, starting fresh somewhere without an HOA and all the baggage that comes with it. But this is my home. I've put work into it, both the physical house and the community around it. I fought to make things better, and now I get to enjoy the results of that fight. Plus, the property values have actually gone up since the reforms. Turns out people are willing to pay more to live in a neighborhood where the HOA isn't corrupt and dysfunctional. Who knew? Sometimes I drive past the old HOA office building and remember that night when I diverted the snowmelt into the window well. The building's been renovated since then, with proper waterproofing and new windows installed. The basement is used for record storage again, but everything's been digitized too, so a single flood can't destroy decades of documents. The window well where my pipe terminated has been filled in and replaced with proper drainage. Ironically, the HOA hired a drainage consultant after the flooding to assess the property and make recommendations. They spent $15,000 on improvements that should have been done years ago. If Patricia had properly maintained the building instead of embezzling funds, the basement never would have flooded in the first place. But that's the thing about neglect and corruption. Eventually, it catches up with you. Sometimes it takes a catalyst, like redirected snowmelt, but the underlying problems were always there waiting to be exposed. Gerald Morehouse actually reached out to me about a year after the divorce. We met for coffee, and he thanked me for uncovering what Patricia had been doing. He genuinely had no idea about the embezzlement. He'd trusted his wife to handle their finances and never questioned the source of money that appeared in their accounts. "I should have paid more attention," he told me, "but I worked long hours and just assumed she was managing things. I never imagined she was stealing from our neighbors." He was rebuilding his life, working as an insurance adjuster in Des Moines. He'd paid off some of the restitution from his share of the house sale, even though legally he wasn't obligated to. He wanted to make things right, or as right as they could be. I respected that. Gerald was a decent person who'd been caught up in someone else's crimes. He deserved a chance to move forward. As for Patricia, I have no idea how she's doing in prison. I don't visit, don't write, don't think about her except when telling this story. She made her choices and faced the consequences. I hope she's using the time to reflect on what she did and why, but that's not my concern. The neighborhood has moved on. New families have moved in, others have moved out, and life continues. The HOA functions smoothly under new leadership. The drama and corruption are in the past, and every winter when the first snow falls, I grab my shovel, clear my driveway, and pile the snow on my lawn without any hesitation. Because that's my right as a homeowner, and no one can fine me for it anymore. That pile of snow, those violation notices, that redirected drainage, it all seems so small when you first think about it. But small actions can have enormous consequences. A $300 fine led to $93,000 in recovered funds and a criminal conviction. An act of petty revenge exposed systematic corruption. A simple snow pile changed an entire neighborhood. I've been asked if I'd do it all again, knowing what I know now. The stress, the conflict, the time and energy it took to fight back and push for change. And honestly, yes, because some things are worth fighting for even when the fight starts over something as simple as where you put snow from your driveway. The lesson I took from all this isn't about snow or drainage or even HOAs specifically. It's about standing up when something's wrong, even when it's easier to just comply and pay the fine. It's about questioning authority when that authority is abused. It's about ordinary people having the power to demand accountability from those in positions of trust. Patricia thought she could bully me into submission. She thought her position gave her unlimited power to harass and fine anyone she didn't like. She was wrong. And her miscalculation didn't just cost her the board presidency. It cost her freedom, her marriage, her reputation, and her future. Meanwhile, I'm still here in my house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, living my life and shoveling snow onto my lawn every winter. Simple, ordinary, and exactly as it should be. That's really the end of the story. No dramatic final confrontation, no last-minute twists, just justice served, reforms implemented, and a neighborhood made better. Sometimes real life is like that. The good guys win. The bad guys face consequences, and everything settles into a new normal that's better than what came before. I still work at the hardware store. I still live at 847 Pinewood Drive. I still attend HOA meetings when important votes come up. But mostly, I just live my life, grateful that I stood up when it mattered and that things worked out in the end. And if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, facing unjust fines from an overreaching HOA board, remember this story. Document everything, know your rights, stand your ground, and don't be afraid to dig deeper when something doesn't seem right. You might just uncover something much bigger than you expected. Because sometimes, a pile of snow on your lawn is really just a pile of snow. And sometimes, it's the beginning of something much more significant. You never know which it will be until you decide whether to fight back or give in. I chose to fight back, and I'm glad I did.